So good evening, I'm Laura Galluzzo from Politecnico, and I can introduce my guest, which is Graeme Brooker, the head of the Interior Design program at Royal College of Arts in London. So hello, Graeme.
Hi, Laura.
Nice to see you.
You too. How are you?
Good. You?
Yeah, really well, thank you. Yeah, we're enjoying some British sunshine, which is unusual over here.
Cool. So are you in Brighton now?
I am in Brighton. Yeah. I've been in Brighton since the lockdown. So that, for anybody who doesn't know where that is, that's on the south coast of the UK, just about an hour south of London.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to introduce you. You already done. Just the first thing, because you had the head of interior design program at Royal College of Art, but you are also the founder and the director of Interior Educators. That is an important charity on this field of interior design. So if you also maybe later you have the opportunity to speak a bit also about this. Try to start from the actual situation. So it's nice to see you in this way, because I think this event is absolutely the go to link each other in this way of loneliness a bit, respect on the past. We usually travel and we meet each other in this way. In the last months it was impossible. So the first question that I have for you is connected with the actual situation. So what do you think, in your personal point of view, about the worldwide situation and especially the UK situation, because you are based there?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Well, I'm sure that, I believe we're now 9 hours into this incredible feast of talking and discussion, and I'm sure many people before me have said the same thing, in that this pandemic has created a really unique situation, and for me personally, a very unique situation, which before the lockdown in the UK in March, I was traveling quite a lot, moving around. I travel a lot for work, full stop. And it was a time for reflection and time to stop, a time to care for family, for friends, to eat well, to exercise, to slow down, to stop moving, and to care for colleagues and really look out for each other. And that for me was the real personal impact, in terms of I was very used to moving around, being very busy with work, etc. So my own personal situation, for what it's worth, was really quite radically different. I'm very lucky in that I live in a very nice part of the UK where we're close to the beach, and so I get the chance to exercise and to go down and take a swim. And I have a house where I've been locked down with my partner, but we have a small garden at the back, so we've been able to get out in that, etc. So personally, I've been in a situation which has been a lot better than many other people. I'm very fortunate. So my own personal situation is not too desperate, but I would like to sort of, and this will lead me to the reason I've chosen this very particular word to discuss later, but I would like to sort of just highlight the UK situation, which I personally feel that we've generally been let down by our government. We've been led very badly into lockdown. It was a chaotic situation. It was done too late and has led to many problems. And now we're being chaotically led out of the lockdown situation. The narrative here is that we're always kind of 2 weeks behind Italy. And I think you guys are slightly more advanced than us. But essentially, politically, it's been very chaotic here in the UK, and the situation has made for a really bad context where we are in Europe. We have one of the highest death rates in Europe per head, and essentially people are still dying. And essentially, we are now being led out of lockdown in a situation which I think is, for many people, quite frightening still and very unedifying, because we are somehow being released from this lockdown in order to kickstart the markets, to get back to consuming, as though things have become this kind of new normal. So From a UK situation, I'm sorry if this is painful or boring for anybody, but I just wanted to make it clear that politically, it has really changed our world, and I'm mildly political, I would say, but it's really galvanized a lot of people into really disrespecting and really being very troubled by the way that our government has led us. And I don't think we're alone in that. When I look to North America and South America, in the global North and the global South there, that's also a very frightening situation, and no doubt in other parts of Europe as well. So I would like to sort of spend my 30 minutes talking about the word that I want to use, because it's partly driven out of this situation, really, which I find quite grotesque and frightening. Sorry for the massive political point, but it's kind of where we are in the UK. We're very upset.
Yeah, no, but I think the concept of this introduction is exactly, we are not on the same boat. Usually we say we are all in the same boat, but it's not true. No, everyone in different places has different experience. Yeah, the keyword that you have chosen is degrowth. And the first question for you is why you have chosen this keyword.
If possible, could I? Well, it's precisely because of the situation here in the UK. Degrowth, if I could explain a little bit what degrowth means, or is what it actually stands for, if you don't mind, and then maybe that will be a bit clearer as to why I choose it. But essentially, I need to clarify, I'm not an economist, I'm not a politician. I'm a designer of interior space. I'm an educator of interior space, which in the big scheme of things is hardly the kind of prerequisite for explaining how the politics of the world works. But the book, the word degrowth, and if you do want something to really understand it by, there's a fantastic book called Degrowth, A Vocabulary for a New Era, which I thoroughly recommend. And essentially, it describes degrowth as, it's a description essentially of a reversal of the illusion of how growth in economics, in politics, in production, in consumption, how this kind of normal mode of operating, which has been with us for over a century now, since the Industrial Revolution, really, how the idea of growth challenges, really in this new context of COVID, how the idea of growth now has to rapidly change and be rethought, and how it needs to be reversed, I would argue, how it needs to be challenged, because the idea of growth as an economic idea, as a political idea, which has characterized us for many, many years, has led to an economic situation which really accentuates the thing that we in the UK and across the world are just about to enter into, which is the restarting of the way that we operate in terms of consumption, in the way that we kind of are just really now consumers, and how it's putting us all in a very precarious position with regards to what the future economy will bring. So that's the word, a description. Why I've chosen it is precisely because of what I said at the start with regards to our economics here in the UK. One of the reasons for my disgust at the political leadership of the UK is precisely because they've been very clear from the start that human life is relatively cheap, and they've sacrificed people, I think, in many regards. In our care homes, we've had extreme problems with COVID. And this is all part of the capitalist project, which is about essentially leading us out of lockdown in order to open markets, in order for us to go out and consume and increase our old ways, moving capital through the system again. And this is at the cost of many, many lives. So that's why I've chosen this word, because it stands very particularly for a way of resisting and recalibrating and attempting to rethink what we've all experienced and just stop and not go back to what we did before. That's why I've chosen it, because I think it's a really important word. And in my view, what our political classes are choosing to do, in my view, is nothing short of grotesque.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you have already explained why this keyword and which is the meaning of this keyword in this specific period of time. But maybe I don't know if you would like to add if for you there was a difference between the meaning of the word before COVID, before the pandemic experience, and now after it or during the experience. I don't know if you would like to underline some aspects of these maybe different meanings of the word.
Yeah, of course. Degrowth stands for a whole number of things, and it's essentially a political movement, or when people talk about degrowth, as much as I understand it, and it's something which I'm relatively new to, but my understanding of it is it's a kind of loose coalition of many thoughts. It's a kind of series of projects, and some extremes it's kind of quite extremely political and based around activism, and in other areas it's very much a critique of everyday life and how we operate. So in a pre-COVID world, and really degrowth has been around as an idea since the sort of early 70s, late 70s really, particularly through French philosophy. Before COVID, it was very much still in the ether, and it was dealing more, I would say, focused towards climate justice, extractivist processes of removing our natural resources, and essentially thinking about how we exist in a sort of post-capitalist society. Now, post-COVID, or currently as we go through the phase of COVID, I would argue that many of these ideas have been kind of speeded up and have become completely central and critical to how we need to think. And maybe in a pre-COVID world, some of these ideas were things that we could relate to or understand or explore in a relatively easy or straightforward way, or maybe in a less kind of critical way. Now I think COVID has really sharpened the challenges of many of these processes. So in a degrowth model, there's lots of talk around things such as development as a kind of problematic idea, which is obviously part of a growth kind of system, the way that you develop things. And so the idea of development in a kind of post-extractivist world, it becomes incredibly interesting. The idea that all of our resources are no longer available, and we can't just go on taking things out of the ground or off of the landscape in order to survive. Care is a degrowth strategy which, for me, in the last sort of 3 months, has become incredibly critical. The idea of caring as a kind of as a strategy for relating not only to your family, communities, friends, and colleagues and their welfare, but also extending the idea of care to buildings, to our built environment, to cities, to neighborhoods, is a really interesting idea of degrowth, because caring about something and looking after it and looking after people is a kind of, and it's not an anti-capitalist way of operating, but it's a way of thinking about things in a very different way, where you don't just discard, but what you do is you look after something and you attempt to maintain it or repair it or tend to its welfare. So for me, I suppose the word pre-COVID of degrowth was out there and was, of course, important and of interest. But for me and some others, I think the COVID situation has sharpened and really brought to the fore the idea that degrowth is something that we really need to think about and become central to our existences.
Yeah, maybe the keyword, the growth. I mean, we experienced more this idea of the growth that before COVID maybe was more elective. It was more for few people and not for everyone. And maybe in this period was not a choice, but a lot of us, were involved in this situation just because the circumstances. Why do you think this keyword, the growth, is linked to the design field, on the other hand? No?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's really important. My work, I suppose, over the years, as I know you know, and maybe if anybody else is listening, they might know, but my work over a number of years as an educator and as a writer of books has been in the field of thinking about reusing buildings. And as I've said already, my background is in interior space. And for me, one of the primary concerns of interior space is about how we reuse existing environments. Degrowth is a way of thinking about resources, essentially, and those can be resources, human resources, and it can also be, obviously, resources of the world. Degrowth approaches are really resource-based, and I would argue that degrowth's relationship to the design of space is directly implicit in the way that we think about the interior as an element which is all about the reuse of existing buildings and existing resources. Because if we imagine the extraction of resources at any more time in a post-extractivist world is just not possible. We have to very quickly get into the mindset, I would argue, that everything that we are ever going to make is already with us. And imagine that as a kind of approach or a strategic approach to reimagining our world. So if we are going to design objects, if we are going to design spaces, we are going to design buildings, I would argue very strongly that forget about the idea of extracting new resource. All resources are already with us. So therefore, if you kind of follow that train of thought, therefore we must reuse everything that we have with us. And what that then leads to is all kinds of interesting challenges with the idea of how material, how matter, how objects, how spaces, how buildings, our interiors need to be constructed with regards to or assembled with material that is already out there. So degrowth is very much a central part of the design of not just spaces, but also interiors as well. Sorry, not just objects, but also interiors as well. And I would argue even for buildings as well. It's not, I don't think it's too hard to imagine in the very, very near future. And if you kind of can imagine, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there was a huge push towards, well, it wasn't unnatural for us to be in a restaurant, if you can remember those things in those days, where you would ask about the provenance of your food and where did this piece of meat or this vegetable come from? How far has it traveled before it's arrived on my plate? I don't think it's a great leap of imagination to now understand that the interior and the built environment and the products that we use around us, the provenance of these things is also now under question. Where have these materials come from? How far have they traveled? And how do we understand them in order to reuse them? So in a post-extractivist model, we can only work with what we have already. And that means understanding materials, it means understanding material passports, it means understanding their life cycle, circular economies, all of those things which are, for me, are an intrinsic aspect of the degrowth agenda. So that's where it starts to become very, very important in the design world. And you know, that's not just designing interior space, it's also about designing buildings, cities, objects, and so on.
Yeah, I think another keyword can be also the design for sustainability. You know, in this case, the sustainability not only for the environment, but also social sustainability. So probably also involve communities, take care of fragile populations, and can be something that can be added to this description that you made about the physical spaces that always are connected with the people and the users that then live and make action and function there. If you have to tell us something about the future development of this keyword in the design world.
Yeah, the future, as I kind of, I'm probably really ramming home maybe over enthusiastically, but the future is essentially, it's not hard to imagine in the future that there will be no more new build. There will be no more constructing anything, building anything, making anything, objects, spaces, buildings, cities, from new material, things that can be considered new build. So therefore, the future of degrowth kind of strategies and approaches is essentially that we all have to understand and we all have to learn how to assemble, how to reassemble, how to repair. We have to understand the notion of the circular economy and how any lifetime of any object or any material or any element is going to have numerous lives and not just one. There's no more discarding. Waste, as a good friend of mine also always says, Duncan Baker Brown, he might even be listening to this, I'm not sure, but Duncan always has this great saying, which I think he's paraphrased it from somewhere, which he says there's no such thing as waste, it's just things in the wrong place. And that's kind of really interesting approach, because that's the sort of mindset that we have to understand in the future. It's not too hard to imagine that everything is with us already, and therefore we need to understand and to learn how we rework that existing material. And that's the future of degrowth. It's really critical because it has an economic and a political dimension, particularly around the idea of the fact that we are not consuming in a way that we once did. I've been absolutely shocked by the kind of, in the UK, we've had the release of lockdown and incredible amounts of people on the evening news are lining up outside of shops to shop again and putting themselves at risk because they're kind of in close proximity to each other. And there's some kind of gene or instinct, impulse, which somehow we have to switch off. We have to kind of work out how we get over this impulse to keep on consuming in this way. And in my view, the idea that if we can accept that what we have with us already is the material for us to repurpose and rework, that for me is the future, if we can somehow understand that and make that become our new normal.
Yeah, it's super interesting, this idea of the future scenario without a new build. And maybe one question that came in my mind during your speech is, okay, and if you have to tell us which is the role of the designers in the future, in this future, what will be for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's really interesting. In my view, the designing is I think a very loaded term, and it's up there with the author, which is also a very loaded and quite frightening term. And I don't think designer as a phrase is as bad, but the author, I have lots of conversations with my students. I'm currently in the middle of the exam process with my students, and we constantly have discussions around the notion of work and where work comes from, and the sort of the absolute fear of authorship. And what I mean by that is students who are nervous about their kind of originality or their kind of invention. So I'm always talking to my students about trying to sort of relax the fear of the original. So for me, the notion and the work of the designer, if we're still going to be called the designer, is much more the editor. It's much more the process of de-authoring. It's much more the processes of assembling. I've recently written a piece for a book which I really enjoyed doing, and it was a book about research methods. Sounds like quite a dry subject, but it was really fascinating because many of the authors had put in these kind of incredible sort of approaches to how they researched, and nobody was talking about how research actually has a problem in that it's constantly, particularly at something like PhD level anyways, constantly looking at the notion of originality and the future model. And in my view, it's actually research is something where in this kind of approach anyway, is much more about inventorizing and assembling and editing what is out there already. And what this approach does is it kind of gives you have the research answer, you have the question answer already when you start this process in research. And the actual process of being a designer is, what are the questions that you're going to ask? So if you, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a reversal of the traditional idea of research where you ask a question and then you look for an answer. in the idea of degrowth and the idea of kind of everything being out there already, the answer's already there. It's a thing that we are working with. Then we then have to ask the questions of it. And it reverses the idea of designing, it reverses the idea of research, and it reverses and makes the designer, if we're still going to call them that, become the editor, become the assembler, become the inventorizer, become the person who aggregates and brings things together in a different way. But they must understand that all of those different ways already have lots of stories, lots of narratives, lots of things already attached to them. And your role is merely to add another layer, another story to that, and accept that somebody else will do that after you as well. So that's the future designer for me, if they still exist.
Yeah, this idea of assembling remind me also the idea of participative design. I mean, I already mentioned the role of the communities, and I think also the designer can work with the users, with the communities, with people to find the, let's say, solutions, the intuitions and the other things from people, because we are not, as designers, the one that can decide for the others in different situations. And I think this is linked with your keyword, with the idea of sustainability that we touched. I mean, we have, I think, 5 minutes left, but I would like probably to ask you in this way, because you are an interior educator. How do you teach, or how do you think in the future will be also our role of teacher with the future designers?
This is a really great question and very relevant at the moment, because obviously we are, I'm sure it's the same for you guys. In fact, I know it is, that, you know, we are kind of trying to understand what work is in terms of our remoteness to each other, how we can educate through platforms such as Zoom and all of these platforms, digital platforms that we're dealing with. So there's a very logistical process of teaching and how we teach through this kind of work. But for me, philosophically, the future of educating students is there's 2 or 3 things. One I've sort of mentioned, which is about the kind of the relaxation of the idea of originality, because I think that notion of invention is actually petrifying, and it inhibits students in huge ways. And I think it's kind of something that is not relevant in the 21st century. The second thing is to develop the ideas from that you are just one in a kind of long line of people who are going to add and remake and remodel and rework all the things that are around us. And the third thing is to sort of understand that this is a very unique sensibility, I think, because not everybody enjoys that idea or wants to do that or likes the thought of repairing or working with something already existing. And so it's the sort of cultivation of that sensibility which is really important, because you have to have that sensibility if you're going to sort of work in this way and assemble and work with the not new, work with stuff that's already out there. And it does require a very particular way of thinking, very particular strategies, which are, you know, very different in other fields and other disciplines and in other areas. And I think this is an approach which does roll right across various ideas of creativity and disciplines and so on. So for me, those are the future challenges for, I think if I was to say the biggest one is to get students to try to understand their position as the non-author in their role of work, and that they are just part of another story in which they kind of have to make sense of a whole series of players and elements and narratives.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Just last thing, if you want, we have the last 2 minutes. If you want to leave with a future scenario or a comment about your keywords.
I think, degrowth is something that I've learnt about in the last year or so, and then has been really sharpened by the COVID situation, and it's fascinating. And there are people out there who are far more knowledgeable and far more learned about this subject than I am. But I would recommend that you look into it, because for me, it's a bigger part of the story of the 21st century and beyond, which is that everything is already out there. don't think about starting from scratch. It's about the tabula plena, it's not the tabula rasa. So learn how to rework what is around you already, because, you know, in 20 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 5 years' time, 3 years' time, I wouldn't be surprised if regulation and legislation says you can no longer use new or extractivist resources.
Thanks a lot, Graeme. Thank you.
Laura, lovely to see you.
It was a pleasure to speak with you.